But how have we done this? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Historian Herbert Butterfield, in The Origins of Modern Science, indicates that the Copernican revolution, quote, outshines everything since the rise of Christianity and reduces the Renaissance and Reformation to the rank of mere episodes, mere internal displacements, within the system of medieval Christendom, while transforming the whole diagram of the physical universe and the very texture of human life itself. It looms so large as the real origin of both the modern world and of the modern mentality, that our customary periodization of European history has become an anachronism and an encumbrance. The true spark which ignited this Copernican revolution was the introduction and adoption of the so-called Copernican principle, named after Nicholas Copernicus. This principle is openly admitted to being defined as a, quote, working assumption that arises from a modified cosmological extension of Copernicus's heliocentric universe. Under the modified Copernican principle, neither the Sun nor the Earth are in a central, specially favored position in the universe. In some sense, it is equivalent to the mediocrity principle. More recently, the principle has been generalized to the relativistic concept that humans are not privileged observers of the universe. Now, it is interesting enough to note that the so-called Copernican revolution, which sparked the alleged scientific advancements of the entire Renaissance period in Europe, is openly based upon the preconceived cosmological assumptions of heliocentrism and a massive isotropic universe. After all, assumptions are just that, assumptions. True science is supposedly driven by the observable evidence alone. However, I would like to propose that embedded within the so-called Copernican principle lies a more implicit philosophical assumption, whose implications are far more significant and far-reaching than the average treatment of the subject typically allows. When we stop and closely examine the cosmological assumptions of this principle, which was not actually expressed by Copernicus himself, by the way, we begin to realize that inherent to all these assumptions is the underlying philosophical and metaphysical assumption of materialism. This most fundamental of assumptions is seemingly almost slipped in without wanting anyone to stop and even take notice. But once you realize it, it's impossible not to see it. In order to operate under these working assumptions, such as the idea that the universe looks the same from wherever it is observed, or that the Earth holds no special privileged position within the universe, one has to already operate under the assumption that the universe as a whole is categorically and qualitatively homogeneous. That is to say, everything there is can be quantified, measured, fit within some to-be-determined set of physical laws. In essence, everything is physical, everything is matter, subject to the same overarching principles of motion and energy, observability and action. In short, materialism. Now, once this philosophical assumption was set in place and accepted within the circles of academia as the foundational piece upon which all else was built, everything which followed that comprised the so-called scientific revolution, through the Renaissance on up to the modern day, carried with it this underlying philosophical assumption. And this is of great consequence, because indeed, from our current standpoint in history, this is not something that is at all appreciated, particularly by people who prefer to hold on to a glowing appraisal of figures like Isaac Newton, who is heralded by many modern Christians as an epitomal example of a seemingly God-fearing Christian man, who furthered the advances of science and human knowledge, because he is believed to have been motivated by a theistic worldview which accepted that the creation should logically have an observable order and that could be measured and calculated with our God-given ability to reason. But men like Newton were not building upon such an oversimplified philosophical framework alone. The materialistic implications of the Copernican principle were being furthered and strengthened by his famous work in Principia and others, whether he was fully aware of their future ramifications or not. Good intentions are not the ultimate measure of truth, and so it was with Newton in his attempt at establishing a mathematical compendium of the physical laws of the universe. Because once the foundational assumption of materialism had been thoroughly applied towards the physical sciences by men such as Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton, and their theoretical mathematical models, it didn't stop there. After the physical sciences had become dominated by this materialistic paradigm, it continued on into the biological sciences. Darwinism did not arise in a vacuum, nor did any of the subsequent academic onslaughts of social and behavioral sciences. What's more, the many offshoots of social Darwinism, such as humanism and communism, all trace their rotten fruit back to the same philosophical seed of this assumed Copernican principle. Once you have eyes to see, you can go back through each chapter of the development of modern scientific thought and trace the steps of how this amorphous thing we now often refer to as scientism gradually spread through Europe and the supposedly Christianized world and systematically attacked every tenet of biblical Christianity, one piece at a time. Like a Trojan horse, the Copernican revolution actually served to inject the precepts of evolution and scientific materialism into cultures which didn't seem to realize where it would all eventually lead. But what's even more amazing is that today in our modern information age, with all the historical resources at our disposal, we seem to appreciate the centuries-long agenda of spiritual subterfuge even less. While millions of people today have the convictional fortitude to question the lie of evolution, despite the fact that the institutions of government and academia all parade it as unquestionable fact, there remains an intellectual and perhaps psychological break between being able to retain a belief in intelligent design and going so far as to question the entirety of all that we are taught to be established scientific fact. Perhaps it is because on some deep subconscious level, there is the realization that a willingness to entertain the idea that Darwinism and Copernicanism are completely symbiotic and inseparable would then mean that having to extricate oneself from a vast succession of phony paradigms and monolithic entrenched false knowledge. It would mean standing apart from the world to a degree that virtually none of us ever imagined having to even consider. It would mean that not only is Darwinism a false premise, but that everything that is said to be established by such giants as Newton, Galileo, and Einstein is also rubbish, because it has all been built layer by layer upon that same underlying philosophical scaffold of Copernicanism. It just becomes too much, too crazy, too massive of a deception to be able to process. Unless you can allow yourself to accept what the Bible says about how the deceptions allowed to be leveled upon humanity are not drawn from the mere imaginations of mortal men. The lie of evolution is part of a spiritual agenda, which is many millennia in the making. To try and battle against this lie of evolution, while simultaneously defending the precepts of broader Copernican materialistic cosmology, is like trying to eradicate a weed by cutting off the leaves while protecting the root. It defies reason. It is ultimately a scenario motivated by pride and fear rather than faith and logic. The Bible tells us that the earth is fixed and immovable, many times and in many places, and it tells us this for good reason, not for the sake of mere intellectual curiosity, but as a devastating blow against this entire false satanically inspired evolutionary materialistic system which engulfs us today. You simply cannot divorce evolution from Copernicanism. Once Satan's counterfeit of God's truth of an earth-centered geocentric universe gained control of higher education, the way was clear to foist this evolutionary counterfeit into the corridors of academia with very little opposition. The road had already been paved. Copernicans Voltaire and Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, were developing an ape-man theories in the 1700s. By the time lawyer Sir Charles Lyell came along with his uniformitarian geology in 1830, evolutionary ideas were fermenting in many universities, awaiting only Darwin's natural selection mechanism to uncork the bottle. Is it really any shock that virtually all early proselytizers of evolution were all avowed Copernicans, having just received that great quantum leap in wisdom from their grandfathers? What we find is that philosophers and other intellectuals, all Copernicans, from Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, through Kant and Hegel, on to Schopenhauer and later to Nietzsche, had established the heliocentric cosmology so solidly over a 300-year period in the universities and publication circles, that even the famous scientist von Humboldt was cowed into silence. Just before Darwin's book came out in 1859, Humboldt said, "I have known too for a long time that we have no arguments for the Copernican system." Still, fear of a scorn of a thoughtless multitude prevented him from saying anything. Thus, secure from any credible attack on their Copernican science, the Darwinian science offensive could then link hands with the established scientific truth of a rotating, orbiting Earth and forge boldly ahead towards the goal of pushing the Bible completely off the stage as a repository of truth. Ernst Haeckel was a powerful force in the establishment of Darwinism. Ernst Haeckel wedded the idea of classical physics, Copernicanism, with the new Darwinian history of nature to form a comprehensive, materialistic cosmology, or anti-theology. This very comprehensive materialist cosmology is what we are up against today, and excepting a handful, most of us don't even realize this. Evolutionism does not stand alone as a Bible-wrecking, contra-scientific deception. No, evolutionism is historically, philosophically, scientifically, and spiritually wedded to a previously conceived Bible-wrecking contra-scientific deception called Copernicanism. The creation movement today denies or ignores this wedded union and thus is not nearly the threat to Satan's kingdom in the world that it can and should be.